Is this some kind of joke? Helen's voice, sharp and lacquered as her nails, cut through the quiet hum of the gun store's air conditioning. Stanley Grant, 84 years old, stood patiently at the glass counter, his reflection a pale, stooped ghost beside her vibrant, disdainful one. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on a vintage M1 Garand mounted on the wall behind her. He had carried one just like it through the frozen hell of the chosen reservoir. Her question hung in the air, a deliberate insult. The other two customers in the store, both younger men, shifted their feet, suddenly finding the rows of polished steel and polymer intensely interesting. The fluorescent lights of Aegis Armory were bright and unforgiving, making the store feel more like a surgical theater than a place that sold tools of history and defense. It was a high-end establishment, all brushed aluminum and tactical displays. Helen, the store's manager, embodied its sterile aesthetic. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe ponytail, and her polo shirt embroidered with the store's logo was crisply starched. She looked at Stanley as if he were a piece of lint on her otherwise perfect world. His clothes were simple and worn, a faded red shirt, clean but frayed jeans, and old leather boots. To her he was an anachronism, a relic who had wandered in from a bygone era and was now fogging up her pristine glass. "Sir," she said, drawing out the word until it became a mockery. "This is a serious place of business. We sell precision instruments, not toys for old men to play with. Are you going to buy something, or are you just here to reminisce?" Stanley finally moved his eyes from the rifle to her. They were pale blue, clouded by age but holding a depth that seemed to absorb the harsh lighting and give nothing back. "I'd like to purchase that M1 Garand," he said. His voice was quiet, a low rumble that seemed to come from his chest, not his throat. It held no tremor, no hint of agitation. Helen let out a short, incredulous laugh. She leaned forward, placing her perfectly manicured hands on the counter. "That is a collector's piece, a fully functional .30-06 semi-automatic battle rifle. It's $5,000, and frankly you don't look like you're in the market for a $5,000 wall hanger." Behind her, a young employee named Kyle, who had been restocking ammunition, froze. He looked from his boss's sneering face to the old man's placid one, a knot of discomfort tightening in his stomach. He knew Helen could be abrasive, but this was a new level of cruel. "I'm aware of the price," Stanley said, his tone unchanging. "I'm also aware of its function. I'm not going to hang it on a wall." This seemed to fuel Helen's condescension. "What are you going to do with it? Take it to the range?" "Sir, the recoil on that rifle could dislocate your shoulder. You have to be able to handle a firearm like that safely. Our insurance policy, not to mention my conscience, requires that I only sell to competent, responsible individuals." The implication was clear. She thought him frail, senile, and dangerous, a liability. One of the other customers, a man in his late 20s wearing a tactical vest and a beard, chuckled under his breath. He was here to pick up a custom AR-15, and this little sideshow was amusing. The other customer, a younger man in a simple hoodie, looked increasingly uncomfortable. He had a military-style haircut, and his eyes kept flicking to the old man, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "I can assure you," Stanley said, his patience a deep, unshakable well, "I am competent." "I'll be the judge of that," Helen snapped. "Let's see your paperwork. Driver's license, firearm purchaser card, and proof of address. And I'll need to run a background check, of course, assuming you even pass." She tapped a long red nail on the counter impatiently. "Chop, chop. I don't have all day." Slowly, deliberately, Stanley reached into the back pocket of his jeans. He pulled out a leather wallet. It was ancient, the dark brown hide worn smooth and soft as cloth in some places, cracked and webbed with 1,000 fine lines in others. The stitching was frayed, and a dark, faded stain marked one corner. He laid it on the glass counter. The sound it made was a soft, tired sigh. Helen wrinkled her nose in disgust. "Seriously? Is that thing going to fall apart on my counter?" As Stanley's gnarled fingers fumbled with the clasp, the world for him momentarily dissolved. The smell of gun oil and air conditioning was replaced by the biting metallic scent of snow and cordite. The bright store lights faded into the gray, unforgiving sky of North Korea in the winter of 1950. He wasn't seeing Helen's sneering face, but the face of his squad leader, Sergeant Frank Miller, 19 years old and aged 100 years by war. Frank was pressing this very wallet into his hand just hours before the Chinese People's Volunteer Army swarmed their position at the Chosin Reservoir. "Here," Frank had said, his breath pluming in the sub-zero air. "Yours is soaked through. Keep your girl's picture in this one. It's good leather. It'll bring you home." The memory was a lightning strike, there and gone in an instant. Frank never made it home. The wallet did. Stanley carefully extracted his driver's license and the necessary permits, his hands slow but perfectly steady. He pushed them across the counter. Helen snatched them up. She scrutinized the license, her eyes narrowing. Stanley Grant, 84 years old. Says here you live over in the old Veterans Housing Complex. Figures. She turned to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard with noisy, aggressive clicks. All right, Stanley. Let's see what secrets you're hiding. The young man in the hoodie had seen enough. He had watched the entire exchange, his anger a slow burn. He wasn't just any customer. He was a recently discharged Army Ranger, Sergeant Thomas Riker. He had spent 4 years in Afghanistan, and he knew a soldier when he saw one. He didn't know the old man's story, but he recognized the bearing. It was in the straightness of his back, despite his age. It was in the unnerving stillness of his hands. It was in the quiet dignity that absorbed every insult Helen threw and reflected nothing back. Most of all, it was in his eyes. Riker had seen eyes like that before, in the faces of men who had seen and done things that civilians like Helen could never comprehend. The way she had mocked the old wallet was the final straw. For Riker, a man's wallet, his dog tags, a worn Zippo lighter, these weren't just objects. They were artifacts of a life, repositories of memory and sacrifice. Helen's disrespect was more than just rude, it was a desecration. While she was busy at the computer making performative sighs and muttering about the slowness of the system, Riker discreetly pulled out his phone. He walked to the far end of the store, near a rack of hunting camouflage, pretending to browse. He didn't call the police. He knew that would only escalate the situation and further humiliate the old man. He scrolled through his contacts to a number he hadn't used in a year, a number he was given by his former company commander upon his discharge. It was a direct line to the non-commissioned officer in charge of the Public Affairs and Community Liaison Office at Fort Hamilton, the sprawling military base just 20 miles outside of town. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Sergeant Major Evans. Sergeant Major, this is Thomas Riker. We met last year. I was in Alpha Company, 3rd Ranger Battalion. I remember you, Riker. What can I do for you? Evans's voice was all business. Sir, I'm at Aegis Armory on the north side of town, Riker said, keeping his voice low. There's an elderly veteran here, and the manager is. She's treating him with extreme disrespect, humiliating him in front of everyone. I think he's trying to buy an M1, and she's treating him like a senile old fool. A lot of old-timers out there, Riker. What's his name? She said it out loud when she took his license. His name is Stanley Grant. There was a profound silence on the other end of the line. Riker thought for a second the call had been dropped. Sergeant Major, are you there? The voice that came back was completely different. The gruff, business-like tone was gone, replaced by something Riker had only ever heard from senior NCOs in moments of extreme crisis. It was a voice of pure, compressed urgency. Riker, what did you say his name was? Stanley Grant, sir. Stay where you are. Do not engage. Do not let him leave the store if you can help it. I'm on my way. The line went dead. Riker stood frozen for a moment, the phone still pressed to his ear. He had expected a thanks for the tip, or a we'll look into it. He had not expected a reaction that sounded like someone had just announced a national emergency. Something was happening. Something big. Inside the Public Affairs office at Fort Hamilton, Sergeant Major Kevin Evans was already moving. He didn't run, but he moved with a speed and purpose that made everyone in the open plan office stop what they were doing and stare. He bypassed his own terminal and went straight to the secure network computer in the corner, one reserved for accessing classified personnel files. He typed in the name, Grant, Stanley T. He hit enter. The screen blinked, and then a file appeared. It was 90% redacted. Entire paragraphs were blacked out. But the words that remained were enough to make the blood drain from Evans's face. Chosen reservoir. Survivor. 5th Special Forces Group, Vietnam. Project Gamma, classified. Instructor. U.S. Army Sniper School, classified. And then at the top, a single gleaming line of text beside a small pixelated photo of a young man with old eyes. Medal of Honor. Congressional. Citation classified. Action date December 2nd, 1950. Evans let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked, stiff-legged, directly to the office of the base commander, Colonel James Davies. He didn't knock. He opened the door and stood in the doorway, interrupting a meeting Davies was having with 2 civilian contractors. Sir, Evans said, his voice tight. We have a situation. Davies looked up, annoyed at the interruption. What is it, Sergeant Major? This had better be important. It is, sir, Evans said, his eyes like steel chips. Stanley Grant is in a gun store downtown, and the manager is about to call the police on him for being old. Colonel Davies's face went through a rapid series of emotions. First annoyance, then confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally, a deep, bone-chilling alarm. He stood up so quickly his own chair banged against the credenza behind him. "Get the car," he said to Evans, his voice a low, dangerous command. "Get my honor guard detail and 2 MP units. Now." He turned to the bewildered contractors. "Gentlemen, this meeting is over." Back at Aegis Armory, Helen was enjoying her power. The background check had come back clean, of course, but she wasn't going to tell Stanley that. She had decided she was going to refuse the sale on principle. It was her store, her rules. "Well, Stanley," she said, turning away from the computer with a triumphant smirk, "it seems your record is clean, but that doesn't change the facts. I am not comfortable selling a weapon of this caliber to a man of your advanced age. It's a matter of public safety, so I'm going to have to refuse the sale." Stanley simply nodded, his face unreadable. He reached for his wallet and IDs. Helen said, placing her hand over his. "Not so fast. The fact that you're here trying to buy a military-grade rifle at your age, frankly, it's concerning. I think I have a responsibility to make a call, a wellness check perhaps, to make sure you're being properly cared for, that you're all there." She tapped her temple meaningfully. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait here. I'm calling the police. For your own good, you understand." This was it, the final unforgivable insult. She was threatening to have him arrested or committed, treating him like a child, a defective object to be handled by the authorities. The man in the tactical vest was now openly grinning, enjoying the show. Kyle, the young employee, looked like he was about to be sick. Thomas Riker, still by the camouflage rack, simply watched the front door, his jaw set. Stanley said nothing. He just looked at her, and for the first time, Helen felt a flicker of doubt. There was something in his gaze, a stillness that went beyond patience. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. It was the absolute lack of fear of a man who had walked through the worst hells the 20th century had to offer and had come out the other side. Before she could pick up the phone, a strange sound penetrated the store's quiet. It was the sound of tires on pavement, many of them moving in perfect synchronized order, a low hum of powerful engines. Then the rhythmic flash of red and blue lights pulsed through the storefront's large windows, bathing the entire showroom in silent, urgent strobes of color. 2 black Suburbans and a military police cruiser had pulled into the parking lot, forming a neat, imposing line in front of the store. They hadn't used their sirens, an omission that was somehow more intimidating than if they had. Doors opened in unison. Colonel Davies, in his immaculate Class A uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was flanked by Sergeant Major Evans and 2 grim-faced military police officers in full gear. The bell on the store's door chimed softly as the 4 men entered. The air temperature seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Every person in the store, Helen, Kyle, the 2 other customers, froze. The sheer, overwhelming authority that had just walked through the door was a physical force. Colonel Davies's eyes scanned the room, instantly dismissing everyone until they landed on Stanley Grant. A look of profound, undisguised reverence washed over the colonel's face. He strode forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply on the concrete floor. He ignored Helen completely, walking right past the counter as if she were a piece of furniture. He stopped exactly 3 paces in front of Stanley. In the dead silent room, Colonel Davies brought his heels together with a sound like a rifle shot. He raised his right hand in the sharpest, most perfect salute Helen had ever witnessed. It was not a gesture of perfunctory respect. It was an act of absolute deference. "Mr. Grant," the colonel's voice was clear, strong, and filled with a respect that bordered on awe. "Colonel James Davies, commanding officer of Fort Hamilton. Sir, it is an honor to finally meet you." Behind him, Sergeant Major Evans and the 2 MPs snapped to attention and rendered their own salutes. Stanley looked at the colonel, and a faint, sad smile touched his lips. He gave a slow, almost weary nod of his head. "At ease, Colonel." The 4 soldiers relaxed, but their posture remained ramrod straight, their attention focused solely on the old man in the flannel shirt. Helen stood behind the counter, her mouth hanging open. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. This couldn't be real. This doddering old man was being saluted by a full-bird colonel. Colonel Davies then turned slightly, not to address Helen directly, but to speak for the benefit of everyone in the room. His voice took on a formal, declamatory tone. "For those of you who are unaware," he began, his eyes still on Stanley, "you are in the presence of an American hero. Stanley Grant enlisted in the United States Army in 1948. He fought with the 1st Marine Division at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, where he was one of the few to walk out of a trap that claimed thousands of American lives. It was there, on a frozen ridgeline, that he single-handedly held off an enemy platoon, saving the lives of a dozen wounded men in his company. For that action, President Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor. A collective gasp went through the store. The man in the tactical vest looked like he had been struck by lightning. Thomas Riker felt a surge of fierce, validating pride. The colonel wasn't finished. After Korea, Mr. Grant became one of the first members of the Army's Special Forces. He served multiple classified tours in Southeast Asia, operating behind enemy lines in conditions you cannot even imagine. When he finally returned home, he didn't retire. He became the lead marksmanship instructor at the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning, where he trained generations of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced. The rifle he was attempting to purchase today, he gestured to the M1 on the wall, was a personal request from me. We are opening a new exhibit at the Fort Hamilton Military Museum, and Mr. Grant, as the foremost expert on historical American military firearms, graciously agreed to acquire and prepare the piece for our display. He finally turned his gaze on Helen. His eyes were not angry. They were cold, dead things, filled with a glacial contempt. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow louder than a shout, "we're going to call the police on him, for his own good." Helen's face had gone from smug to confused, to utterly bloodless. She looked like a ghost. I didn't know," she stammered. He just looked. He looked old," the colonel finished for her. "You judged a book by its cover, and you have no idea the library you just insulted." Before he could continue, Stanley held up a frail hand. "That's enough, Colonel." All eyes turned to him. His voice was still quiet, but it commanded the room. He looked at Helen, not with anger or triumph, but with a profound, weary sadness. "Ma'am," he said, "respect isn't something you give people because of the uniform they wear or the medals on their chest. You give it because they're a human being. The young man who bags your groceries, the woman who cleans your office, the old man who wants to buy a rifle, they all deserve the same basic dignity. That's the lesson. I hope you learn it someday." As he spoke, he absently touched the worn leather of his wallet on the counter. The image flashed in his mind again, sharp and clear. Young Sergeant Frank Miller, 19 years old, dying in the snow, his last words a whispered plea to tell them we fought like hell. The wallet wasn't just a container for his ID. It was a promise he had kept for over 70 years. A promise to live a life worthy of the one Frank had lost. Colonel Davies nodded stiffly. He turned back to Helen. "As of this moment, any and all procurement contracts between Fort Hamilton and Aegis Armory are hereby terminated. We will not do business with an establishment that treats our nation's heroes with such contempt. Sergeant Major, pay the woman for the rifle." Sergeant Major Evans stepped forward, produced a government credit card, and completed the transaction in grim silence. Helen, moving like a robot, packaged the rifle. The MPs took possession of it. The colonel then turned to Stanley. "Sir, will you allow us to give you a ride home?" Stanley nodded. "I'd like that very much, James." As the soldiers respectfully escorted Stanley Grant out of the store, the bell chimed his departure. The remaining people were left in a stunned, ringing silence. 3 weeks later, Helen was working the late shift at a diner 20 miles from town. The story had gone viral locally. The videos recorded by the man in the tactical vest who was now trying to pass himself off as a supporter were everywhere. Her business had collapsed within days. This was all she could find. Her hair was down, her face was pale without makeup, and her uniform was a cheap polyester apron stained with coffee. The bell on the diner door chimed. An old man in a flannel shirt walked in and took a seat at the counter. It was Stanley Grant. Helen froze, a pot of coffee shaking in her hand. She thought he was there to gloat, to rub her nose in it one last time. But he just looked at the menu. "I'll just have a cup of black coffee, please," he said, his voice exactly the same as it was in the store. Quiet, calm, her hands trembling, she poured the coffee and set it in front of him. He smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said. He drank his coffee in silence, watching the traffic pass by outside the window. When he was done, he placed a $10 bill on the counter, more than enough for the coffee, and stood to leave. "Have a good night," he said, and walked out. Helen stared at the $10 bill. She looked at his retreating back. He hadn't come for revenge. He had come for coffee. He had treated her with a simple, basic dignity. The very thing he had spoken about, the lesson delivered not with a shout but with a quiet gesture, landed with the force of a physical blow. She finally understood. And for the first time in a very long time, Helen felt a profound and painful sense of shame. It was a beginning. The stories of heroes like Stanley Grant are all around us, hidden in plain sight. They are our neighbors, our family, and the quiet strangers we pass on the street. If you were moved by this story, Please like and share it to spread the message of respect. Subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.